July 17, 1944. The calm waters of the Pacific shimmered under the scorching sun as the USS Mason DE-529 patrolled 78 nautical miles southwest of Ulithi Atoll. Below decks, machinist's mate first class, Leonard Roy Harmon, wiped sweat from his brow, confident that the destroyer escort's routine mission would continue without incident. The ship's crew had no idea that in less than 6 hours, they would face a catastrophe that naval engineers would later call mathematically impossible to survive. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how one man's desperate improvisation, dismissed by his superior officers as utterly ridiculous, would save 276 lives and reveal how innovation often comes from those the military was determined to overlook. The USS Mason sliced through the Pacific waters with practiced efficiency, her engines humming steadily as she maintained her position in the escort formation. The vessel was one of hundreds of destroyer escorts commissioned during the war's height, tasked with protecting the vital supply convoys that served as America's lifeline across the vast Pacific theater. While seemingly identical to other ships in her class from a distance, the Mason carried a distinction known throughout the fleet, but rarely acknowledged in official communications. She was one of only a handful of ships with a predominantly black crew. Harmon, get down to Auxiliary Generator 3. Chief says it's making that noise again, called out Lieutenant Junior Grade William Parker, a young officer from Boston who had been assigned to the Mason 6 months earlier. Yes, sir. On my way, replied Harmon, setting aside the maintenance log he'd been updating. At 32 years old, Leonard Harmon was older than most of the enlisted men aboard. Born in Cuero, Texas, he had joined the Navy in 1939, before war seemed inevitable to most Americans. His experience and steady demeanor had earned him respect even within the rigid racial hierarchy of the 1940s Navy. As Harmon made his way through the narrow passageways of the ship, he nodded to fellow crewmen who stepped aside to let him pass. The Mason's unique crew composition had created an unusual social environment. While still operating under the Navy's strict segregation policies, the practical necessities of warfare had forced a degree of integration that would have been unthinkable in civilian life. The ship's commander, Lieutenant Commander William Blackford, was a pragmatic officer who had initially resisted the assignment to command what was colloquially referred to as Eleanor's Folly, a reference to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt's advocacy for black sailors to serve in roles beyond mess attendants and stewards. 6 months into the deployment, Blackford had grudgingly admitted to his executive officer that the ship ran as efficiently as any he'd served on. Mason's running better than half the ships in the escort group, Blackford had confided after the last efficiency evaluation. But you keep that observation to yourself, Parker. No need to encourage unrealistic expectations. Down in the engine room, the air was thick with heat and the smell of oil. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Wallace, a white sailor from Pennsylvania who served as the ship's senior engineering rating, looked up from the auxiliary generator with evident relief as Harmon approached. There you are, this damn thing is making that knocking sound again. I've checked the usual suspects, but I can't pin it down, Wallace said, wiping his hands on a rag. Harmon nodded and knelt beside the generator, placing his ear against the metal housing. The subtle variations in machinery sounds were a language he had become fluent in through years of service. Sounds like we've got a fuel mixture problem, Chief. Maybe a partial blockage in the line. Let me pull the injectors and check. Go ahead. I need to check in with engineering control. Give a shout if you find anything, Wallace said before heading toward the forward section of the compartment. The relationship between Harmon and Wallace exemplified the complex dynamics aboard the Mason. While officially maintaining the Navy's racial protocols, practical necessity had created a grudging professional respect. Harmon's mechanical aptitude had proven invaluable on several occasions, earning him responsibilities that would typically be denied to a black sailor. As Harmon worked on the generator, Seaman First Class James Monroe approached. At 19, Monroe was one of the youngest members of the engineering division and had naturally gravitated toward Harmon as a mentor. "They're saying we might be diverted to Leyte Gulf soon," Monroe said in a low voice. "Word is there's a big operation brewing." Harmon continued working as he responded. You know better than to put stock in scuttlebutt, Monroe. We go where they tell us, when they tell us. I know, but Phillips in radio said he heard the officers talking. Says it's going to be the biggest landing operation yet. Before Harmon could respond, the general quarters alarm sounded throughout the ship, its urgent clanging instantly transforming the atmosphere. Both men dropped their tools and moved quickly toward their battle stations, the practiced routine taking over. All hands, general quarters, this is not a drill. Man your battle stations, came the announcement over the ship's communication system. Harmon's battle station was in Damage Control Team 2, positioned amidships to respond to any emergencies during combat. As he made his way there, the ship's engines increased in power, and he could feel the vessel heeling slightly as it executed a sharp turn. "What's happening?" Monroe asked as they moved quickly through the passageway. "We'll find out when we need to know," Harmon replied, maintaining the professional detachment that had served him well throughout his naval career. When they arrived at their station, Damage Control Officer Lieutenant Samuel Green was already briefing the assembled team. "Radar has picked up what appears to be a Japanese submarine, approximately 8,000 yards off our starboard bow. We're executing evasive maneuvers and preparing for possible depth charge deployment." The team quickly checked their emergency equipment, fire extinguishers, breathing apparatus, repair materials, and tools. The ship continued its evasive pattern, the deck vibrating with the strain of the engines at full power. In the command center above them, Lieutenant Commander Blackford was studying the radar display with intense concentration. "Sonar contact confirmed, sir," reported the sonar operator. "Bearing 045, range decreasing. Profile matches I-class submarine. Maintain evasive course. Prepare depth charges for deployment," Blackford ordered. "Signal the convoy to continue on course. We'll deal with this." The USS Mason was now the hunter, breaking away from the convoy to intercept the submarine threat. On the ship's deck, sailors prepared the depth charge racks, the cylindrical weapons ready to be rolled into the ocean at the captain's command. Below, in the damage control station, Harmon and his team waited in tense readiness. The minutes stretched out in the hot, confined space as the ship maneuvered aggressively. Suddenly, they felt the distinctive shudder as depth charges were deployed, followed seconds later by the muffled underwater explosions that reverberated through the hull. "Direct hit, sir," came the excited report from sonar. "Target is breaking up, detecting underwater explosions and debris." A cheer went up throughout the ship as the announcement was relayed. The Mason had scored its first confirmed submarine kill, a significant achievement for a destroyer escort. As the crew celebrated, Harmon exchanged a look with Monroe. They both understood what this meant. The Mason had proven itself in combat, challenging the prejudiced expectations about the capabilities of its predominantly black crew. The celebration was short-lived. As the ship circled back to rejoin the convoy, a violent explosion rocked the vessel. Harmon was thrown against the bulkhead, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear the damage control alarm sounding. "We've been hit," shouted Lieutenant Green. "Team 2 with me to the engine room." As they rushed toward the source of the explosion, Harmon's mind raced through the possibilities. The submarine they'd thought destroyed must have managed to fire a torpedo before sinking. Either that or there was a second submarine they hadn't detected. When they reached the engine room, they were met with chaos. A torpedo had struck the aft section of the ship, tearing through the hull and into the engine compartment. Seawater was pouring in through the breach, and several machinery components had been damaged in the explosion. "Get those pumps running!" Green shouted over the noise of rushing water and hissing steam. "We need to seal this breach before we take on too much water." Harmon quickly assessed the situation. The torpedo had caused significant damage, but it hadn't struck any of the main fuel tanks or magazines. That was the only stroke of luck they had. As he moved to help with the emergency repairs, he noticed something that sent a chill through him despite the heat of the engine room. One of the auxiliary fuel lines had been severed by shrapnel from the explosion, and fuel was spraying into the compartment, mixing with the incoming seawater and creating a slick that was spreading toward the still operating machinery. "Lieutenant," Harmon called out, pointing to the fuel leak, "we need to shut down all electrical systems in this compartment immediately. If that fuel hits a spark from the damaged wiring, we'll have a fire." Green assessed the situation quickly and nodded. Electrician's mate, cut power to this section. Everyone else, continue damage control operations. As the electrical systems were shut down, emergency lighting kicked in, casting the chaotic scene in an eerie red glow. The incoming seawater was now waist-deep in the lowest part of the compartment, and the ship had developed a noticeable list to starboard. "Sir, we've got another problem," Harmon reported after examining the damage further. "The main fuel transfer pump is damaged. We won't be able to move fuel from the reserve tanks to the active tanks. What does that mean for our operational status?" Green asked, concern evident in his voice. "It means we've got about 3 hours of fuel for the functioning engine before we're dead in the water, sir." The gravity of the situation settled over the damage control team. A disabled ship in these waters was vulnerable to further attack, and their current position, hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly port, made rescue operations challenging at best. Lieutenant Green relayed the information to the bridge, while Harmon and the rest of the team continued their efforts to control the flooding and assess further damage. It was during this assessment that Harmon discovered something even more alarming. The explosion had distorted a section of bulkhead near one of the main fuel tanks. The metal was visibly strained, with small droplets of fuel seeping through microscopic cracks. The structural integrity of the tank was compromised, and the constant motion of the ship was placing additional stress on the damaged section. "Lieutenant," Harmon called Green over, "we've got a serious problem here. This main tank is compromised. If that bulkhead gives way, we'll have thousands of gallons of fuel flooding into a compartment with damaged electrical systems and hot machinery." Green examined the damaged bulkhead and frowned. "How long do you think it will hold?" "Hard to say, sir. Could be hours, could be minutes if we hit rough seas or take another hit." "Recommendations?" Harmon considered for a moment, drawing on his years of experience with naval machinery. "We need to transfer the fuel out of this tank immediately to reduce the pressure on the bulkhead, but with the transfer pump damaged." He paused, an idea forming in his mind. It was unorthodox, against standard procedures, and potentially dangerous in its own right. But given the circumstances, it might be their only option. "Sir, I think I know how we can do this. It's not by the book, but it could work." "I'm listening, Harmon." "We could use the fire suppression system to create a vacuum effect. If we reconfigure the pipes and use the pressure differential, we might be able to draw the fuel out of the damaged tank and into one of the undamaged reserve tanks." Green looked skeptical. "You're suggesting we use a system designed for water to transfer highly flammable fuel?" "Yes, sir. It would require bypassing several safety protocols and manually controlling the flow, but physically it should work." "That sounds incredibly dangerous, Harmon. One spark in the wrong place and we'd have a bigger explosion than what the torpedo caused." "I understand the risk, sir. But if that bulkhead fails, we're looking at an uncontrolled fuel spill that will definitely reach an ignition source. At least this way, we control the where and how." Lieutenant Green rubbed his forehead, weighing the options. Finally, he nodded. "Let me take this to the XO and the captain. Continue damage control operations in the meantime." As Green left to consult with the ship's command, Harmon turned to Monroe and the other damage control team members. "We need to prepare for this procedure just in case they approve it. Monroe, find Chief Wallace and bring him here. Peterson, I need you to check our inventory of flexible hose couplings. Roberts, start mapping out the fastest route to bypass the fire suppression system's normal configuration." The team dispersed to their tasks, while Harmon continued to monitor the damaged bulkhead. The seeping fuel had increased slightly, a worrying sign that the structural integrity was continuing to degrade. Meanwhile, on the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Blackford was facing the most difficult decision of his naval career. His ship had taken significant damage, was at risk of a catastrophic secondary explosion, and was operating in waters known to be patrolled by enemy submarines and aircraft. "You're telling me that Harmon wants to pump fuel through the fire suppression system?" Blackford asked incredulously, after Lieutenant Green explained the proposed solution. "Yes, sir. He believes it's our best option given the circumstances." "And what do you think, Lieutenant?" Green hesitated before responding. "It's unorthodox and risky, sir, but Harmon knows those systems better than anyone else aboard. If he says it can work, I'm inclined to believe him." Blackford turned to his executive officer. "Parker, your assessment?" Lieutenant Parker had been reviewing the damage reports. "Sir, our options are limited. The bulkhead is failing. That's confirmed by 3 separate observers now. If we do nothing, we're looking at a major fuel spill within hours, possibly sooner. The risk of fire or explosion in that case is extremely high." "And evacuation options?" Blackford asked. "We've sent the distress call, but the nearest ship that could assist is over 4 hours away," Parker replied, "and that's assuming they don't encounter enemy resistance en route." Blackford paced the bridge, considering the situation. His responsibility was to his ship and his crew, regardless of their background or the unusual circumstances of the Mason's commissioning. After a long moment, he made his decision. "Tell Harmon to proceed with his plan. But I want every possible safety precaution taken, and I want regular updates every 15 minutes. "Yes, sir," Green replied, immediately leaving the bridge to relay the orders. Back in the damaged engine room, Harmon received the news with a curt nod. "All right, we're proceeding. Chief Wallace, I need your help to reconfigure the system controls." Wallace, who had arrived minutes earlier, looked skeptical. "This is completely against protocol, Harmon. We'd be court-martialed for even suggesting this under normal circumstances." "These aren't normal circumstances, Chief, and I'd rather face a court-martial than burn to death or drown." The chief engineer reluctantly nodded. "What do you need?" "First, we need to isolate this section of the fire suppression system from the rest of the ship. Then we need to create a controlled access point to the damaged fuel tank and establish a flow path to the reserve tank." As Harmon outlined his plan in greater detail, the engineering team began to implement the necessary modifications. It was delicate, dangerous work, complicated by the continued flooding and the ship's increasingly pronounced list. In the 4 hours that followed, Harmon directed an operation that naval engineers would later study as an example of innovative problem-solving under extreme pressure. Using a combination of standard equipment and improvised solutions, they created a system that used pressure differentials to slowly drain the damaged fuel tank into secure reserve tanks. The process was painstaking and fraught with danger. Twice, they had to stop and address leaks that threatened to spray volatile fuel onto nearby surfaces. Once, a spark from a failing emergency light nearly caused disaster, saved only by the quick action of Seaman Monroe, who smothered the potential ignition source with a fire blanket. Throughout the ordeal, Harmon maintained a calm, methodical approach that steadied the nerves of the younger sailors working alongside him. His voice remained level, even when giving urgent commands. His movements deliberate and precise despite the lurching of the damaged ship. "Steady on that valve, Monroe," he directed, as they neared the completion of the fuel transfer. "Too much pressure and we'll rupture the line. Too little and the flow stops." Monroe, sweat pouring down his face, nodded and made a minute adjustment to the valve he was controlling. "How much longer, Harmon?" Harmon checked the makeshift gauge they'd rigged to monitor the fuel levels. "Another 20 minutes at this rate. The tank's nearly empty." From the corner of his eye, Harmon noticed Lieutenant Green enter the compartment, accompanied by the executive officer, Lieutenant Parker. "Status report, Lieutenant Green," Parker demanded. "Sir, we've transferred approximately 87% of the fuel from the damaged tank. The pressure on the compromised bulkhead has been significantly reduced, and the seepage has all but stopped." Parker observed the operation with a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. "This is the most unorthodox damage control procedure I've ever witnessed," he remarked. "Harmon, I understand this was your idea." "Yes, sir," Harmon replied, not taking his eyes off the pressure gauge. "The captain wants to see you on the bridge once this procedure is complete, assuming we don't all go up in flames first," Parker added dryly. "Understood, sir. We should be finished in about 20 minutes. As predicted, the fuel transfer was completed successfully 22 minutes later. With the immediate danger of explosion averted, attention turned to the other damage control priorities: controlling the flooding, restoring power to essential systems, and assessing the ship's overall seaworthiness. After ensuring that his team could continue without him, Harmon made his way to the bridge as ordered. Despite hours of intense physical labor in the hot, cramped engine compartment, he took a moment to straighten his soaked uniform as best he could before reporting to the captain. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Blackford was conferring with his navigation officer when Harmon arrived. The captain looked up, noting the machinist's mate's appearance with a raised eyebrow. "Machinist's mate First Class Harmon, reporting as ordered, sir," Harmon said, standing at attention despite his exhaustion. "At ease, Harmon," Blackford replied. "Lieutenant Green and Chief Wallace have informed me of your actions in the engine room. They seem to think you've performed some kind of miracle down there." "No miracle, sir, just applied mechanics and a bit of improvisation." "Improvisation," Blackford repeated the word with emphasis. "Is that what you call bypassing half a dozen safety systems and pumping aviation fuel through pipes designed for water?" Harmon remained silent, unsure if he was being reprimanded or praised. "Do you know what the standard protocol is for a compromised fuel tank in combat conditions, Harmon?" Blackford continued. "Yes, sir. Evacuate all non-essential personnel from adjacent compartments, establish a containment perimeter, and prepare for emergency fuel jettison if structural failure appears imminent." "And at what point in that protocol does it suggest reconfiguring the fire suppression system as a fuel transfer mechanism?" "It doesn't, sir. That was an improvisation based on the specific circumstances we faced." Blackford studied Harmon for a long moment before speaking again. "Your improvisation was reckless, dangerous, and completely contrary to established naval procedures." He paused. "It was also, apparently, exactly what was needed. Lieutenant Parker informs me that your actions likely saved this ship from a catastrophic explosion. For the first time since entering the bridge," Harmon allowed himself to relax slightly. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet, Harmon. When we reach port, there will be an official inquiry into this incident. Your actions will be scrutinized by men who weren't here, who didn't face the choices you faced. Some will question your judgment." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Blackford leaned forward. "Because I'm not sure you appreciate the complexity of the situation. You're a machinist's mate first class. You're also a Negro sailor in a navy that, until very recently, wouldn't have allowed you to serve in any capacity other than as a steward. The fact that you're standing on my bridge right now, having implemented a solution that naval engineers would have dismissed as theoretically impossible, represents a challenge to a lot of deeply held assumptions." Harmon remained silent, all too aware of the realities Blackford was describing. "For what it's worth," the captain continued, "I'll be reporting that your actions were conducted under my direct authority and with my full approval. Whatever comes next, you won't face it alone." "Thank you, sir." "That's all, Harmon. Return to your station. We still have a damaged ship to get back to friendly waters." As Harmon turned to leave, Blackford added, "And Harmon, good work today." The acknowledgement, simple as it was, represented a profound shift. In that moment, Harmon was being evaluated not as a black sailor, but simply as a sailor who had done his duty exceptionally well under extreme circumstances. The USS Mason limped back to the naval base at Ulithi Atoll, arriving 36 hours after the torpedo attack. Despite the damage, the ship had maintained enough power and maneuverability to avoid further enemy contact, a testament to the skill of its engineering crew. Upon arrival, the ship was immediately surrounded by repair vessels and damage control teams. Naval engineers boarded to assess the damage and were astounded by the improvised fuel transfer system they discovered in the engine room. "You ran fuel through the fire suppression system?" one incredulous lieutenant from the base engineering staff asked Harmon as they inspected the setup. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. It should have blown up in your face." "But it didn't," Chief Wallace interjected, having overheard the comment. Harmon knew exactly what he was doing, calculated the pressure differentials precisely. Monitored for electrical discharges. It wasn't luck, it was damn good engineering. The lieutenant looked between Wallace and Harmon, clearly surprised by the chief's defense of a black sailor. "Well, I suppose results speak for themselves, but I wouldn't recommend adding this to the damage control manual anytime soon. Some situations require thinking beyond the manual," Harmon replied quietly. As promised, an official inquiry was convened to review the incident. Harmon was called to testify, an unusual occurrence for an enlisted man, particularly one of his race. The inquiry board consisted of senior officers from various technical branches, none of whom had ever served with a predominantly black crew. Machinist's mate First Class Harmon Please describe in your own words the events following the torpedo impact, the inquiry chairman, Captain Harold Jenkins, requested. For the next hour, Harmon provided a detailed technical account of the damage assessment, the discovery of the compromised fuel tank, and the implementation of his improvised solution. He answered questions with precision and clarity, demonstrating a depth of engineering knowledge that surprised several board members. Machinist's mate Harmon, one commander on the board, said, "Your solution, while effective in this instance, represents a significant deviation from established damage control procedures. Do you not think this sets a dangerous precedent?" "With respect, sir, I believe damage control procedures are guidelines based on anticipated scenarios. When faced with an unanticipated scenario, adaptation becomes necessary. The precedent, if any, should be for thorough technical understanding and creative problem-solving, not for specific improvisations." The commander seemed taken aback by the sophisticated response. "I see. And you developed this understanding through your naval training?" "Partly through training, sir, partly through practical experience, and partly through my education before joining the Navy. I studied engineering at Prairie View A&M College for 2 years before enlisting." This revelation caused several board members to exchange glances. The notion that a black sailor might have formal engineering education had clearly not occurred to them. The inquiry concluded with a mixed finding, acknowledging that Harmon's actions had likely saved the ship, while also emphasizing that such improvisations should not be considered standard procedure. Lieutenant Commander Blackford, true to his word, took full responsibility for authorizing the unorthodox approach. What followed in the weeks and months after the inquiry reflected the complex racial dynamics of the wartime Navy. Officially, Harmon received a commendation for his actions, but it was a muted acknowledgement compared to what might have been awarded to a white sailor for similar heroism. The story of the USS Mason and its unconventional damage control operation was not widely shared throughout the fleet, as might normally happen with innovative solutions. Yet, unofficially, word spread among naval engineering circles. The ridiculous plan that had saved a destroyer escort became a case study discussed in hushed tones at officer clubs and in engineering wardrooms. Harmon's name was sometimes mentioned, sometimes not, depending on the comfort level of those discussing the incident with acknowledging a black sailor's technical achievement. For Harmon himself, the experience reinforced what he had always known, that capability and courage were not determined by race, and that in the most critical moments what mattered was competence, not color. As the war progressed, he continued to serve aboard the Mason with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his naval career. The broader significance of the incident aboard the USS Mason would not be fully recognized until years later, when the slow process of naval integration began in earnest. Incidents like Harmon's ridiculous plan that worked would be cited as evidence that segregation policies were not just morally wrong, but practically inefficient, denying the Navy the full benefit of all sailors' capabilities. Lieutenant Commander Blackford, for his part, underwent his own transformation following the torpedo incident. Having witnessed firsthand the capabilities of his crew, he became a more vocal advocate for their recognition and advancement. In his final evaluation report before being reassigned, he wrote, "The men of the USS Mason have performed their duties with exceptional skill and dedication, meeting or exceeding all reasonable standards of naval service. Any limitations on their future assignments, based on factors other than individual merit, would represent a disservice not only to these men, but to the Navy as a whole." 6 months after the torpedo incident, Harmon was promoted to Chief Petty Officer, one of the first black sailors to achieve that rank in a technical specialty. The promotion came with little fanfare outside the Mason, but aboard ship, it was recognized as a significant milestone. "Never thought I'd see the day," Chief Wallace remarked during the small ceremony, "but damn if you haven't earned it, Harmon, or should I say Chief Harmon." "Thank you, Chief Wallace," Harmon replied with a slight smile. "Means a lot coming from you. Just stating facts. You've forgotten more about these engines than half the engineering officers in the fleet ever knew. About time, the Navy started recognizing it. The friendship that developed between the two chiefs, one black, one white, represented another small but significant change, catalyzed by their shared experience during the crisis. Professional respect had evolved into personal regard, challenging the social boundaries that persisted even as institutional barriers began to erode. As the war entered its final phase, the USS Mason continued to serve in the Pacific, escorting convoys, engaging enemy submarines, and occasionally supporting amphibious operations. The ship and its crew had proven themselves repeatedly, earning a reputation for efficiency and effectiveness that belied the doubts that had surrounded its commissioning. In April 1945, as American forces pressed ever closer to the Japanese home islands, the Mason was assigned to escort duty for a supply convoy bound for Okinawa, where one of the war's bloodiest battles was raging. The waters around Okinawa were hazardous, with Japanese submarines and kamikaze aircraft presenting constant threats. On the night of April 12th, radar operators aboard the Mason detected a formation of aircraft approaching from the north, the direction of mainland Japan. General quarters was sounded, and the crew rushed to their battle stations. Chief Harmon, now serving as the lead damage control officer, prepared his teams for what might come. "Multiple bogies inbound, bearing 015, range 40 miles and closing," reported the radar operator on the bridge. "All hands, prepare for air attack," Lieutenant Commander Richard Taylor, who had succeeded Blackford as the Mason's commander, announced over the ship's communication system. "Gunners, stand ready. Damage control teams at the alert." In the tense minutes that followed, the Mason's crew waited as the Japanese aircraft approached. The convoy scattered according to predefined protocols, while the escort vessels, including the Mason, formed a protective screen around the vulnerable supply ships. When the attack came, it was swift and determined. Japanese kamikaze pilots, driven by a desperate patriotism and the knowledge that their nation was losing the war, aimed their aircraft directly at American ships with the intention of causing maximum damage through suicide attacks. The Mason's anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the first kamikaze entered range, filling the night sky with tracer rounds. One aircraft burst into flames and plunged into the ocean. Another was hit multiple times, but continued its deadly approach toward one of the supply ships, before a final barrage from the Mason's guns sent it spiraling away from its target. A third kamikaze, perhaps recognizing the Mason as a threat to its fellow aircraft, suddenly changed course and dove directly toward the destroyer escort. The ship's guns tracked the attacker, scoring hits that damaged but did not disable the aircraft. "Brace for impact," shouted Lieutenant Commander Taylor, as the kamikaze, trailing smoke but still under control, aimed for the Mason's bridge. At the last moment, the aircraft's wing clipped the ship's radar mast, causing it to veer slightly from its intended target. Instead of striking the bridge, the kamikaze crashed into the forward deck, its momentum carrying it partially into the ship's forecastle before its fuel and remaining bombs detonated. The explosion rocked the Mason, tearing a hole in the forward section and starting fires that threatened to spread to the ammunition storage areas. Chief Harmon's damage control teams deployed immediately, fighting the flames and assessing structural damage. "Get those fires under control before they reach the forward magazine," Harmon ordered, directing his teams through the chaos. "Team 2, check for casualties in the forward compartments. Team 3, assess structural integrity." As the damage control efforts proceeded, a second wave of kamikazes appeared on radar. The Mason, despite its damage, continued to provide anti-aircraft fire in defense of the convoy. One of the ship's 40mm gun mounts had been destroyed in the kamikaze hit, reducing its defensive capability. "Chief Harmon," called out Lieutenant Parker, who had remained aboard the Mason as its executive officer. "We've got a serious problem. The impact damaged the forward fire control system. We're blind to anything approaching from sectors 1 through 3. Harmon quickly grasped the implications. With a third of its detection capability offline, the Mason was vulnerable to further attacks from specific angles. The ship's gunners would have to rely on visual sighting alone, a dangerous proposition in the darkness and chaos of battle. Drawing on his knowledge of the ship's systems, Harmon proposed another unconventional solution. "Sir, we can reconfigure the secondary radar system to cover the blind sectors. It wasn't designed for fire control, but with some adjustments, we could provide basic tracking data to the forward guns." "How quickly can you implement this?" Parker asked, aware that time was critical with enemy aircraft still in the vicinity. 30 minutes if we bypass the normal calibration sequence, Harmon replied. It won't be as accurate as the primary system, but it's better than nothing. Do it, Parker ordered without hesitation, the previous year's experience having taught him to trust Harmon's technical judgment. As with the fuel transfer system months earlier, Harmon's improvised radar solution required technical knowledge beyond standard training and the willingness to adapt systems for purposes other than their intended design. Working with a small team of electronics technicians, he modified the connections to divert the secondary radar's data to the fire control systems, creating a jury-rigged but functional replacement for the damaged primary radar. The modification was completed just as the second wave of kamikazes came within range. With the improvised system providing targeting data, the Mason's gunners were able to engage aircraft approaching from all sectors, maintaining the ship's defensive capability despite its damage. By morning, the attack had been repelled. 3 supply ships had been damaged, 1 severely, but none had been sunk. The Mason, along with the other escort vessels, had successfully protected the majority of the convoy, a vital achievement given the critical need for supplies at Okinawa. As damage assessment continued in the light of day, the full extent of the Mason's injuries became apparent. The kamikaze had caused significant damage to the forward section, and fires had compromised several compartments. Nevertheless, the ship remained seaworthy and capable of continuing its escort duties after emergency repairs. In his report on the engagement, Lieutenant Commander Taylor specifically noted the performance of Chief Harmon and his damage control teams, writing, "The quick and innovative response to battle damage, particularly the adaptation of secondary radar systems to maintain fire control capability, directly contributed to the ship's continued combat effectiveness and the successful defense of the convoy." This acknowledgement, more direct and substantive than what had followed the torpedo incident, reflected the evolving recognition of black sailors' contributions as the war neared its end. While systemic discrimination remained deeply embedded in naval policies and practices, individual commanders like Taylor were increasingly willing to evaluate performance based on results rather than race. For the crew of the USS Mason, the kamikaze attack and their successful response to it represented another validation of their capabilities. They had faced one of the war's most feared threats and had prevailed through skill, courage, and the kind of innovative problem-solving that had become their hallmark. As the war in the Pacific entered its final months, the Mason continued to serve with distinction, escorting convoys and participating in the blockade of Japan's home islands. When news of Japan's surrender reached the ship on August 15, 1945, the crew celebrated with a mixture of joy and relief, aware that they had contributed to a historic victory, while also demonstrating the fallacy of racial restrictions on service and capability. For Chief Harmon, the end of the war brought new considerations. The Navy was reducing its size dramatically as the need for a massive wartime fleet diminished. Many sailors, both white and black, were being discharged as ships were decommissioned and crews consolidated. In November 1945, as the Mason prepared to return to the United States for potential decommissioning, Lieutenant Commander Taylor called Harmon to his cabin for a private conversation. "The Bureau of Naval Personnel is offering you the opportunity to remain in service, Chief," Taylor informed him. "With your technical qualifications and combat experience, they're recommending assignment to the engineering training facility at Great Lakes." Harmon was surprised by the offer. Training positions were coveted assignments, and the implication that he would be instructing both white and black sailors represented a significant departure from pre-war practices. "I appreciate the recommendation, sir," Harmon replied. "May I ask what prompted it?" Taylor smiled slightly. "You can attribute it partly to your service record, which speaks for itself, and partly to some rather forceful advocacy from your former commanding officers. Both Commander Blackford and I submitted recommendations highlighting your technical innovations during combat conditions. The Bureau was particularly interested in your approach to the fuel transfer problem and the radar reconfiguration. The acknowledgement that his ridiculous solutions had garnered official interest was gratifying, but Harmon remained cautious. And the fact that I would be instructing white sailors as well as Negro sailors. Times are changing, Chief. Slowly, perhaps, but changing nonetheless. The war has demonstrated that artificial restrictions based on race are not only unjust, but inefficient. The Navy, like the rest of the military, is being forced to reconsider some of its long-standing practices. Harmon nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to accept the assignment, sir. If my experience can help prepare other sailors, regardless of their background, I consider that worthwhile service. Excellent, I'll inform the Bureau of your acceptance. Taylor paused before adding, For what it's worth, Chief, it has been an honor serving with you. Your actions aboard this ship have saved lives and contributed to our success in ways that go far beyond what might be expected of your rate and position. Thank you, sir. The honor has been mine as well. In January 1946, the USS Mason was decommissioned, its wartime service concluded. Many of its crew, both white and black, returned to civilian life, carrying with them experiences that would shape their perspectives on race, capability, and cooperation for decades to come. Chief Harmon reported to the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in February, becoming one of the first black chief petty officers to serve as an instructor in a technical specialty. His appointment was not without controversy. Some white sailors initially objected to receiving instruction from a black chief, and some administrators expressed concern about disrupting established protocols. Yet Harmon's technical expertise quickly overcame most resistance. Sailors who wanted to learn about advanced damage control techniques and innovative engineering solutions found that the color of their instructor's skin mattered less than his ability to impart potentially life-saving knowledge. Over the following years, as the Navy gradually moved toward official integration, finally mandated by President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, Harmon's role as an instructor expanded. He developed specialized courses on emergency engineering procedures, drawing on his wartime experiences to prepare a new generation of sailors for the unexpected challenges they might face at sea. The story of the ridiculous plan that saved the USS Mason from explosion became part of the unofficial lore of the Navy's engineering community. While seldom appearing in official histories or training manuals, it was shared among instructors and students as an example of how theoretical knowledge, practical experience, and creative thinking could combine to solve seemingly impossible problems. In 1952, as the Navy's integration process continued, Harmon was promoted to warrant officer, a commissioned rank that recognized his technical expertise and leadership abilities. The promotion represented another milestone, both personal and institutional, in the long journey toward equality within the naval service. At his promotion ceremony, now Captain William Blackford, Harmon's former commanding officer from the Mason, was present as a guest of honor. After the formal proceedings, Blackford approached Harmon with an extended hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Harmon," he said, using the formal address for a warrant officer. "This promotion is long overdue." "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your support both now and during our time on the Mason." Blackford nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've had command of 3 ships since the Mason, good ships with capable crews, but I've never again witnessed the kind of innovative problem-solving you demonstrated during that torpedo incident. That experience changed my thinking about a lot of things." "Mine as well, sir," Harmon replied, though perhaps in different ways. "No doubt," Blackford agreed with a slight smile, "but that's the value of shared experiences, isn't it? They can lead different men to different conclusions while still creating a common understanding." This philosophical observation, coming from an officer who had initially resisted command of a predominantly black crew, reflected the complex personal transformations that had accompanied the Navy's institutional changes. For Blackford, as for many naval officers of his generation, the demonstrated capabilities of sailors like Harmon had challenged preconceptions and opened minds to new possibilities. Leonard Harmon's naval career continued into the 1960s, spanning an era of profound change both within the military and in American society at large. He retired as a chief warrant officer in 1967, having served for 28 years and witnessed the Navy's transformation from a rigidly segregated institution to one where opportunities were, at least officially, open to sailors regardless of race. Throughout his career, Harmon maintained the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his service aboard the Mason. He never sought recognition for his wartime innovations, preferring to focus on teaching the technical skills that would help future sailors survive crisis situations. His legacy lived on primarily through the hundreds of engineers and damage control specialists he trained, many of whom went on to distinguish themselves during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. It wasn't until 1994, nearly 50 years after the war's end and more than a decade after Harmon's death, that the Navy formally recognized the contributions of the USS Mason's predominantly black crew. In a ceremony at the Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C., surviving crew members were honored for their pioneering service, and the ship's unique role in naval integration was officially acknowledged. During the ceremony, a naval historian recounted the story of the improvised fuel transfer system that had saved the Mason after the torpedo attack, identifying Harmon by name as the architect of the solution. For many in attendance, including high-ranking naval officers and civilian officials, it was the first time they had heard the full account of what one admiral called an engineering feat that defied conventional wisdom. Among those listening was James Monroe, the young seaman who had worked alongside Harmon during the crisis. Now in his 70s, Monroe had gone on to his own distinguished naval career, retiring as a Master Chief Petty Officer in 1984. Chief Harmon would have been embarrassed by all this attention, Monroe remarked to a reporter covering the event. He never saw himself as doing anything extraordinary. To him, it was just applying what he knew to solve the problem at hand. But what made it remarkable was that he had the courage to propose a solution that more senior officers had dismissed as ridiculous, and the skill to implement it successfully under the worst possible conditions. The reporter, intrigued by this personal recollection, asked Monroe what lesson he thought should be drawn from Harmon's story. Monroe considered the question before responding. "I think the lesson is that innovation often comes from unexpected sources. When you restrict opportunity based on preconceptions about who can contribute or who has value, you don't just harm those individuals. You deprive yourself and your organization of potential solutions to your most pressing problems." The Navy learned that lesson slowly and at great cost. I hope the rest of society can learn it more quickly. This insight, born from Monroe's first-hand experience of both discrimination and gradual change, captured the broader significance of Harmon's ridiculous plan and the Mason's wartime service. Beyond the technical achievement of saving a ship from explosion, beyond even the personal courage demonstrated in crisis, the incident represented a challenge to the artificial limitations that had constrained individual potential and institutional effectiveness. In the decades since the USS Mason's service, the Navy, like other American institutions, has continued to evolve in its approach to diversity and inclusion. The process has not been linear or without setbacks, but the direction has been toward greater recognition that capability and character, not demographic characteristics, should determine opportunity and advancement. For historians of naval integration, the story of Leonard Harmon and the USS Mason offers a compelling case study in how exceptional performance under extreme conditions can challenge deeply held prejudices. The ridiculous plan that worked when conventional approaches would have failed stands as a testament to the value of diverse perspectives and the danger of dismissing solutions based on their source rather than their merit. Perhaps most significantly, Harmon's story illustrates how technical excellence can transcend social barriers. In the midst of battle, with lives at stake and a ship in danger, what mattered was not the color of the sailor proposing the solution, but the effectiveness of the solution itself. This reality, demonstrated repeatedly during World War II, would eventually contribute to the breakdown of formal segregation within the military and, by extension, in American society more broadly. Today, visitors to the National Museum of the United States Navy can view a small exhibit dedicated to the USS Mason and its unique place in naval history. The display includes a technical diagram of Harmon's improvised fuel transfer system alongside photographs of the ship and its crew. A placard describes the torpedo incident and the innovative response that saved the vessel, identifying Harmon as the architect of the solution. For modern naval personnel viewing the exhibit, the technical aspects of Harmon's solution remain impressive, a testament to ingenuity and applied knowledge under extreme pressure. But equally important is the social context in which that innovation occurred. A navy and a nation in transition, where capability was beginning to be recognized regardless of race, and where ridiculous ideas from unexpected sources were sometimes exactly what was needed. In naval engineering classes, the principle that Harmon applied, using pressure differentials to redirect fluid flow through systems not designed for that purpose, is now taught as a standard emergency procedure. The specific technique he pioneered, once dismissed as too dangerous to consider, has been refined and incorporated into damage control manuals, potentially saving other ships and crews in future crises. This technical legacy, perhaps more than formal recognition or historical commemoration, would have pleased Harmon himself. Throughout his naval career, his focus remained on practical solutions and effective service, not personal recognition or social commentary. He understood that in the most critical moments, when lives and missions hang in the balance, what matters is not who proposes a solution, but whether that solution works. The USS Mason's story reminds us that progress often emerges from crisis, when immediate needs override established prejudices. In the heat of battle, with a ship at risk of explosion, conventional thinking about who could contribute was temporarily suspended, creating an opening for capability to be recognized regardless of color. That opening, initially narrow and specific to one critical situation, would gradually widen through repeated demonstrations of skill and courage, eventually contributing to institutional and social change. For the modern Navy, which has evolved to embrace diversity as a source of strength rather than a challenge to be managed, the lessons of Harmon's ridiculous plan remain relevant. Innovation can come from any source, and dismissing ideas based on preconceptions about their originators risks missing solutions to the most pressing problems. This understanding, hard-won through experiences like those aboard the USS Mason, continues to inform both naval practice and broader social attitudes. In this sense, the legacy of Leonard Harmon and his fellow sailors extends far beyond the specific crisis they faced in 1944. Their service demonstrated not just individual courage and technical skill, but the fundamental fallacy of racial restrictions on opportunity and advancement. The ridiculous plan that saved a ship from explosion also helped, in its own small way, to chart a course toward a more inclusive and effective naval service. As we reflect on this largely forgotten episode from World War II, we are reminded that history is made not just by grand strategies and famous leaders, but by the ingenuity and determination of individuals responding to immediate challenges. Harmon's innovative solution, born from necessity and implemented against conventional wisdom, represents the kind of adaptive thinking that has characterized American military success throughout the nation's history. That this innovation came from a black sailor serving in a segregated navy adds another dimension to the story, highlighting both the artificial limitations imposed by discrimination and the human capacity to transcend those limitations when circumstances demand. The USS Mason's experience reminds us that progress often emerges from the gap between official policies and operational realities, where practical necessity can sometimes overcome entrenched prejudice. For modern readers, the story of the ridiculous plan that worked offers insights that extend beyond its historical context. It speaks to the value of diverse perspectives in problem-solving, the danger of dismissing unconventional approaches, and the importance of evaluating ideas based on their merit rather than their source. These lessons, derived from a specific wartime crisis, retain their relevance in addressing the complex challenges of our own time. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.